1988 to now. And even within that agency, it's changed a lot.
Oh, okay.
In terms of,
okay.
So
yeah, that's the kind of thing that will that'll play in. Yeah.
Perfect.
Good.
All right. Do you want to do the intro for the YouTube or just jump right in it? It's up to you. It's whatever you want to do.
I always keep your intro in the YouTube
I like it.
clip, so go for it.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another session of American Public Policy Redux. Today is, it's number 9. We've done this 9 times now. That's so exciting. It's Thursday, October 29th, 2020, and we are going to talk about what you believe about Pat's proposed new theory of policy making. So if you want to, feel free to just unmute yourself now. Pat's going to provide a bit introduction to just recap what we did, what he presented last time is his new theory, just to provide a quick refresher, and then, and especially for anyone watching it on YouTube. And then the floor is ours for tonight. But Pat, go right on ahead and you can share screen. You should be able to share screen.
Okay, let me get that up here first. Come on, Patrick. Oh, there we go. Boom. Okay, y'all got it? And I'm sorry. I should probably scroll up here.
Oh, and remember that if you're unmuted, you will be recorded. I forgot to mention that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Is that too small? Can people see it? Okay. So basically, it's not as though that old model has completely disappeared. It's just that its relevance or applicability has declined, so that it applies to a smaller number and a smaller range of different kinds of policy proposals that might get addressed. So that if it doesn't fit into the structure of partisan conflict, then you get the old model, okay? And in that old model, if you remember, I would draw all these little sub-governments up on the board, each one of the sub-governments dealing with a particular specific narrow area of public policy, and they operated in isolation from each other. That was the fragmentation of the old policy process. And within each one of them, you had a symbiotic cooperative set of relationships between the 3 sets of actors: the private interest groups, the bureaucratic agencies, and members on the congressional subcommittees, okay? And they would normally, through that cooperation, achieve consensus that did not consider partisanship at all, that Democrats and Republicans might have minor differences, but they would be able to come together on a policy that would benefit the re-election of every single one of them, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, okay? And then in the larger sense, log rolling would occur, so that each one of the sub-governments would allow the other sub-governments to get what they want in return for their preferred policy being supported in Congress, okay? That fragmented cooperative way of making public policy worked most of the time, but it could be challenged by those outside actors. And that included anybody with a general perspective and outside of there. So it included the political parties, for one, the key one, right? It includes the president, includes the courts, includes public interest groups, okay? All of those folks were on the outside. If they hoped to challenge the subgovernment, they needed to change the language and the framing of those policies from the material framing that was focused on specifics, because that was something that everybody on that committee could get on board with. Bureaucratic agencies dealt with stuff in the specifics, okay? So if there were the outside actors, public interest group, the president, whomever, who wanted to challenge what was going on, they needed to then employ symbolic language that would bring the key outside actor, the mass public, into the fray. Putting pressure, particularly on those members of Congress, on the, whether they're on the subcommittee or not, put pressure on members of Congress whose primary goal was re-election. So if you have enough public involvement, you can then push members of Congress away from the kind of cooperative outcome that was going to come out of that subgovernment. And you may be able to break down the operation of the subgovernment at the subcommittee or committee level, okay? But it required using symbolic language and symbolic framing, okay? And again, the key outside actor is the mass public, because the mass public translates into votes, potentially, right? You know what, let me do a little more on that one. And the symbolic portrayal is designed to get the public just not involved, not just involved, but like wildly involved, so that you convince members of Congress that citizens are going to vote on this issue, okay? It's easy if it's a private interest group. Think NRA. If you can convince members of Congress that a bunch of folks are going to vote on the basis of this issue that they're addressing, you can get them to move, okay? I mean, they understand that ordinary citizens don't pay that much attention, and they may well forget anything by the time the election rolls around. But if the public is really, really outraged and they're really involved, then you might put a little more pressure on those members of Congress to actually respond to ordinary citizens, right? This was the undemocratic quality of the old system, right? You had to do something extraordinary to get representatives to actually pay attention to their constituents, their unorganized constituents, okay? All right. On the other hand, if the policy is going to fit into the structure of partisan conflict, okay? So the parties have taken clearly defined positions which are pretty far apart from one another. That's the partisan, the parties take positions, polarization, they're far apart. If the issue fits into that structure, then we move to this new model where everybody then who wants to have any kind of impact has got to line up on one side of the partisan divide. Anybody. And I put down there, because I think it'll be fun to talk about, the role of the courts, because I think they were one of the, I think that's an interesting topic, and it's a problematic thing for their legitimacy, as John Roberts from time to time figures out. And then on the other side, bureaucratic agencies cannot line up on one side or the other, so they're left out of the process in terms of policy making. They may jump in when we get to implementation. That'd be kind of fun to get at, but at this stage, they're not the key actors. Political party now dominates the process and structures the participation of everybody else. Okay. How's that for a summary? Does that work, guys?
That's great. And I feel like when I read this too, that it just reemphasized what we had talked about previously. When I read your description of the new model, it reemphasized what we had talked about previously regarding the increased role of party leadership, right? So party leadership will determine if it's not clear, like you have you have gun control, for example, that's very clear. One party tends to be on one side. If it's not automatic, right, then leadership will determine which side of the issue the party will be on.
Yeah, and of course, the key leader is the president. But Michelle's point is still more broadly applicable, okay? Because it does matter what's going on with party leadership.
So
yeah,
Pat, this is Ann. I have a question. How do you think this lines up with the current appropriations process? Because it's not as if there's one issue. There's so many issues. Like, is it all about either the Dems, the leadership on either side giving their blessing to the appropriation? But it's a little bit more complicated. It might even be a little bit mixed. Not sure.
No, I think you're right. I think it is mixed, and what you see, because that covers the full range of policy, right? So some of those areas of appropriations are more afflicted with partisan polarization than others. So you would see different kinds of things going on. However, there's still the overall kind of matter of appropriations where you're going to have just on the general level of spending, Republican Party leadership is going to want less spending in virtually every area except the military. And Democratic leadership is going to be looking for more spending in just about every area except the military. You get some weird things like, I remember always trying to talk about agricultural policy just because I live out on a farm and it's boring as shit. Well, part of the boring as shit thing means it doesn't quite as neatly fit into that partisan divide, and in spite of the fact that increasingly, and they've always been this way, but farmers are just overwhelmingly Republican. But nonetheless, I think that might be one example, Anne, where in terms of the level of spending, maybe even the types of programs, you'd be more likely to get a little bit of negotiation and compromise between Democrats and Republicans when it came to appropriations. Does that make sense, Anne?
It does. Yeah, it does. And I'm also thinking about.
We're not going to be happy about anything, are we?
Right. But it made me start thinking about, because my observation is, again, and I think we talked about this at some point, about, there's so little being done on the authorization side in terms of new legislation.
Right.
And so much is sort of done through appropriation. But I think maybe one impact of the polarization is that we're not seeing, this would be a question for the group, we're not seeing a lot of major legislation being developed and working its way through Congress, because there's just not that sense of give and take. So
yeah, as long as you have divided control, right?
As long as you have divided control.
Yeah.
But, we'll see if for some reason the House and the president are all the same party. In the past, that didn't always translate into legislative action, right? There have been times where we've had that. So
and I think
would it be different now?
Well, I think a little different. I
Yeah.
think reasons that it didn't necessarily happen in the past, that was largely with Democrats. And you do have, I mean, I think I made this point last time, you do have more more range within the Congressional Democratic Party. And it wasn't fair. It's just because I hate Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman was my anecdotal example, who, you know, sticks his wrench in the works and says, no, we're not doing socialized medicine. We're not going to have a single payer plan, and stops it. And you have some Democrats from more moderate districts. Well, the interesting thing that's happening now is, I mean, you're going to get more with this election, just because if at the presidential level things go the way that we think, okay, that's going to pull in some Democrats in marginal districts, even in some districts that Republicans might ordinarily win. Well, they're not going to be going along with the Democratic Party leadership. So they will cause problems. They won't cause the same kinds of problems for the party that the Tea Party, wingnuts, and the House Freedom Caucus, oh, they are. They're just loopy. You could talk to most Republicans in Congress, and they would want to take the Tea Party members there out and shoot them. They don't have any use for them. The difficulty for the Democrats will be they're going to have greater range within the party. And they're also going to get, I mean, there are folks in the party who are getting radicalized in response to the Trump presidency. And that will further extend the range within the party. And that's going to cause problems, even if they have unified control. I'm sorry. I'm gonna look forward, and that means whatever. If all these things happen, Biden needs to hit the ground running. You really have to. That was Reagan's. I don't know whether he figured it out or somebody figured it out for him, but by hammering on the budget right away, he took advantage of his honeymoon period and got things done. Now, he didn't have to deal with partisan polarization, but the lesson remains. If you get unified control, Biden comes in and you've got Democrats controlling the House and the Senate, you will still need to move quickly to get things done easily, or you're going to start running into problems, particularly as you enter the second year and those vulnerable members of the House are looking forward to re-election and worrying about how conservative their district might be. Does that sound about right to Anne?
It does, yes.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. Other stuff. What do y'all got to say?
We had somebody just wanted to clarify the role of bureaucratic agencies in the new theory, and saying, do they play a role at all or none at all, or do they just fall in line? And then people started talking about implementation, of course, and then that's coming up.
Well, you know, let me throw that back at you guys. Just because some of you have experience there, and that's not, I mean, that to look forward to the implementation part, that's a major issue in terms of understanding what's going on here, because bureaucratic agencies usually operate invisibly. to the outside world. Nobody really knows. You really have to kind of get immersed in that system. It doesn't get covered ordinarily by journalists, so you don't get stuff coming out. So I'm, in terms of the policymaking process, folks who've kind of been there, what have you seen occur when the issue that's being addressed, relevant to the agency, fits into that structure of partisan conflict? What have you seen?
I mean, I can speak to the congressional side of it. I think Anne raised a good point about appropriations. I think it's more that bureaucratic agencies have a role on the partisan side if it's a proposal that's coming from the administration, right? So if it's coming through their budget and they're proposing a big policy change via the budget, they play a pretty big role in that. Each of the agencies get the budget passed around, they all put in their feedback. So that's probably the biggest role that I would see when it's a partisan issue. But otherwise, if it's a partisan issue that's originating in Congress, then it's like much less likely that bureaucratic agencies would be drawn into that, right? And it's a little too political because it's starting from that side rather than the administration proposing it.
But is the agency just carrying water for the president then?
So
there's a difference, right? There's a difference between doing what the president tells and supporting what the president tells you he wants done. And I mean, if you remember in the classic budgetary process, it didn't even freaking originate with the president. It originated with the agency. Okay, so you're already shifting.
Yeah,
what's going on?
So this is Anne. So the president's budget that's presented is really a representation of what OMB wants on behalf of the president, at least the way. So we don't propose funding amounts. We are given funding amounts, and then we are told what to write in the budget justification that supports what the president wants. So there is no coming up with great ideas and sending them forward and then them deciding whether they want to include them in the budget. It's very directive.
And I would say that's state level too.
On like career staff versus political appointees. And maybe that's the difference when, Pat, maybe when you're referring to bureaucratic agencies, you're just speaking about career agency staff versus political appointees.
Yeah. Because those are the ones with the expertise. It's not the political appointees. They don't know squat.
Yeah, we're not asked to provide expertise relative to the budget. We write narrative to the budget that supports whatever the administration wants to do with our funding line. And it's really irrelevant as to whether we think it's a good idea and the best use of funds or the best way to administer a program. That's just not what that process is about.
Yeah,
that sounds similar to the state of Georgia budget process, similar to what Anne's describing.
So the governor pretty much drives it, and
the agencies fall in line.
Yeah.
And it's so the extent to which the budget gets influenced maybe by I think the interest groups are the ones who, this is not really relative to the budget, but well, I guess it sort of is, but sometimes the interest groups will carry the water to the hill for the bureaucratic agencies in terms of content and expertise.
That's a really cool addition. Did everybody catch that?
Can you repeat it again?
Yeah, please do.
So the interest groups who the bureaucratic agencies work with on an ongoing basis, either through funded projects or just because, they're in their content area, they will carry the water to the hill, sometimes for the bureaucratic agencies, when the bureaucratic agencies can't, in terms of content and expertise.
So you're trying to, so the poor bureaucratic agency is trying to backdoor the backdoor the process
It's certainly not that. That never happens.
That's exactly how it works for us. I mean, we, as representing long-term institutional investors, I spent a lot of my time lobbying the Securities and Exchange Commission for a lot of things at the SEC a lot. It happens constantly that we'll ask regulators, what is it that, or we'll ask the agency, what is it that you guys would need most of all to accomplish X goal? These are the people on the Hill who are the key committees that you need to interact with. Here is what we would say is the most important thing. You need to take that message back to Senate Banking or House Finance. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question then. You can engage in that strategy, and it's pretty. I'm actually kind of recalling incidents where that's happened. I just hadn't remembered it. What about their effectiveness? Does that work? And remember, we're talking primarily about those situations where it fits into that framework of partisan conflict. Okay, so you go ahead and you send the interest groups there to lobby on your behalf, based on, with the expertise that, if you'd been asked, you could have provided in the process, would have formed your budget request if you're doing the budget the old way. Does that strategy work? I'm sorry, that's a lousy way to put it. That implies a yes or no. How does it work? How well does it work? What happens when they try that?
Well, I always view it as, Pat, this is Ann, I go back to the old, when the policy window opens and there's an opportunity.
Okay.
So if there happens to be an opportunity that just occurs for a variety of reasons, and the interest group has that information, and again, it's aligned with their interests, right?
Right.
So then it can be, it can be effective. Now, anyway, I think it's even more complicated than that, but because it depends on the interest group and it depends on their influence and who their supporters are, right? So if you're the AMA, or let's just say the National Diabetes Association, who's backed by many physicians, right, who make a lot of money, by providing services to diabetics or pre-diabetics, it tends to be more influential because it's supported by a constituency that probably also contributes, campaign dollars to congressional members. So that gets back to the.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do y'all get how hilarious this is? You have turned the two key inside actors in the subgovernment into outside actors. Oh, come on. You got to appreciate the perversity of that. Right? Because they're having to, and they're doing it in using different kinds of strategies, but they're still having to kind of come up with creative ways to challenge the power of the parties to structure things.
Yeah, and the thing is, the agencies, to get our work done, in many cases, right, we're never going to have the resources to accomplish many of the goals that we want. So you develop strategic partnerships with interest groups and organizations who have a shared goal, right? To, in our case, improve, if you're trying to improve the health or the public health of a community in a certain area. So you have and it's not just about going to the Hill, it's just you have a shared goal. the diabetes, division in CDC aligns very well with the American Diabetes Association because they have a common goal and they work towards that in different ways. So there's sort of the policy and the Hill strategy, and then there's just programmatic work that they collaborate on and research, and they do research in areas. So there's a lot of layers there about how agencies work with basically NGOs. Is what we don't call them interest groups, we call them NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
Yeah. But that is exactly the kind of relationship that existed in the old policymaking system, right?
Right, that hasn't changed.
Yeah. It's just that then it's a matter of how that the conditions under which that strategy of relying on those interest groups to challenge maybe what the majority party wanted. How well does that work? And again, my guess is that fits into that distinction between the old policymaking model and the one governed by partisan conflict. But I think the more that we can fill it out, the better. Go ahead, Adrian.
So I was intrigued when I looked back at this new policy piece because it really felt like you were either in one decision, you either said yes or said no, and that's where the policy lands, right? So at least in my experience, right? So I'm spent time as a technology consultant. So I end up being pulled into some of these governmental conversations around a policy area that is very new. Now, the experts they brought into the hearing yesterday were the CEOs of major tech companies,
right?
Not necessarily the experts you'd want to weigh in on the ethic and moral behavior of technology companies. All that to be said. I do think there is this sense of, I get brought into projects that really feel like they're the no area of a policymaking process. For example, let's bring smart light poles into our neighborhood and build the infrastructure for a smart city. And what you've seen with a lot of these municipalities is what you thought was a fairly mild, nonpartisan conversation. The minute someone says, "What are you doing with my data?" it becomes a partisan issue, right? And so it jumps the fence in midstream from one side to the other. And I think when we talk about these bureaucratic agencies working the process the other way, it's almost as if trying to move an issue that was partisan back over to the other side. Right. So I almost see it as more of a flow between the two sides, depending on the trajectory of that policy and how much attention certain aspects of it might lend itself into more of a conversation that's partisan, or once it's been partisan for a little while, it's been put in a corner for a little while, nobody's talked about it, it's no longer a big issue, it can actually move back into that old model and move itself forward. Just a thought.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's part of the oversimplification when I dealt with the old model, but I did want to, I did say you could challenge, those outside actors could challenge what was going on in those sub-governments under certain kinds of conditions. Well, Adrian just kind of laid out, well, in the new system, maybe the interest groups and agencies can challenge the system of partisan conflict in the way that Anne was describing earlier, and at on another level, or using different language, it's this battle over framing, the degree to which it's going to be regarded as symbolic. When Adrian talked about, well, it's my data, and it's issues of privacy and confidentiality, which are more symbolic, more emotional, so you're going to have fights over how you frame the issue, and that means skillful issue entrepreneurs can work that system better than less skillful. And that's the art rather than science part of the whole thing. Yeah, that was very nice, Adrian. Yeah. Others.
So I know that we're not talking about implementation, but it's really hard not to mention it because in the new partisan, I mean, it is so clear that the partisan way is at play when you get to implementation, because we work, in my job, I work with all of the state offices and we have contracts and we do all these projects. And under the partisan way, it is so clear that no one spoke to anybody and they're just like, do this. And then all of a sudden you're having to try to implement things that are completely unreasonable and make no sense. And they've never been done a particular way and are not based on any type of logic. And all of a sudden you're just like, how the heck, and why are we even expected to do these things? It's just absurd. And so one workaround that we've been doing with our state DHHS office is they've actually been contracting with our state private cap agency to take on contracts with around different projects, to take it off of their plate in a way to get away from the bureaucracy that exists for them during this really partisan time. Yeah. So it's like their workaround is basically like, okay, how about rather than us doing it, you guys do it, but we'll help give you money and we'll put it in our budget that it's for this project, but you guys have the contract and don't have to go through our process. I mean, that's like how we're navigating during these really, especially with CARES Act stuff. It is awful.
Yeah. I mean, what that's doing is, and so I really want to come back to that when we get to implementation. But I think one of the things that you highlight there is, I mean, look, this is my moment of. I actually have lots of moments of confession, so it's not isolated. It's the sin of academics is that we get trained to be critical. So everything I was presenting in class, I was looking for the damned warts. What's wrong with da 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 da? And certainly one of the things that I wanted to get people to think about involved the lack of a democratic quality in the policymaking process. Because the mass public was disadvantaged, they were one of those outside actors and they didn't have any kind of impact. Of course, the parties being another outside actor. In my defense, I did say that what the interest groups and agencies provided was a kind of mixed blessing, because they at least were two entities that brought expertise and information to bear. It often was biased. That was the partisan analysis part of the whole thing, but they at least brought information to bear. When it then becomes more democratic by having the parties come in and kind of structure everything that's going on, I mean, that's in some sense, it's more democratic, but you then have shut out those sources of expertise and information that could have better informed the process. And that's,
but I think
Megan highlighted that, I think.
But I think, this is Ann, I think when it's a partisan issue, I think you kind of said this, it's just the expertise doesn't matter.
Right.
If it's on the other side, then the expertise that can be provided through interest groups or bureaucratic agencies, it does matter. But when it's so partisan, and people play games with that, right? So, what we say in public health is, most of medical care actually doesn't have an evidence base. Okay, but there's strong interest in lobbies that support the healthcare system. I mean, there's so much money in it, right? And public health is held to a much higher standard of quote evidence to show that what we do is effective, that the healthcare industry has and medical industry has never been held to, right? And it's just because we don't have those powerful interest groups. So there's just a lot of hypocrisy about it. And you saw that like in the healthcare debate. I mean, there's so many things we could be doing and investing in relative to public health that would actually save a hell of a lot of money, but it's kind of irrelevant because it doesn't save money because anyway, there's a lot of reasons why, but there's just, I don't know, it's just, there's a lot of complexity there, I guess. I'll leave it at that.
And I mean, to sort of go back to where a number of you have been coming with this, so that if I'm an issue entrepreneur within an interest group or an agency, I'm trying to find ways to take the sort of symbolic partisan content out of play, so that I move the issue from the, yes, this does fit into partisan conflict, to no, not so much. And if you can do that, then you have a chance. It's just that I have.
Or you tie it to the symbolic politics, or you try to tie your issue to the symbolic politics.
Oh, but then you're
That's the other way.
Yeah, but then you're prey to whoever is the majority party.
Or you just take it out of the game altogether. So,
Yeah.
and what I mean by that is that I've been doing a ton of work, and I'm sure you too, on social determinants of health. I'm on all sorts of national groups and like projects around this.
Yeah.
There's no way, and at every conference I go to, they're like, the government is not going to address this. Like, it is up to private, like
Yeah.
it is up to the private world to address or in the United States, because we're just not going to do it. Like, it's not going to happen in the government.
Yeah. So you see it then shifting to states that aren't controlled by the same party as the national level. So they move forward, and you do stuff in the private sector and in those isolated states. So you continue to have strong attempts at environmental regulation in California, New York, and those.
California is doing all the work on social determinants of health too. Surprise.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, climate change is a great example too, right? There are, at this point, it's private entities and selected states that are keeping things from going in the toilet any faster than they already are.
And public-private partnerships as being the financing and funding model that brings characters into the mix that are profiting off of that, right? So there's an opportunity to, like, when the funding is not there to move the needle forward, localities will then partner with private companies to move the needle without that, right?
Right.
And as long as you can get people to fund it, you're good to go, right?
Right.
One other weird permutation of this is, if you think about it from the Government Accountability Agency standpoint, which is where I work, we are a state agency, but we're not executive branch. We're independent, and we're funded through the Congress or through the General Assembly. But we go in and evaluate, and this is where there's going to be intersection between policy making and implementation. We evaluate how well they've implemented policy, and we come out with recommendations. And oftentimes those agencies really hate when we're there. We're all up in their business. What's their outcomes? They don't like to be held accountable sometimes. Some of them actually do see it as an opportunity. And so we'll come out with recommendations, and sometimes it's the way you've written this law has led to these really bad outcomes. And the agency will say, we have been trying to get this law changed for so long, and they take our report, which is viewed as nonpartisan, objective, and credible, and they take that report as evidence to get a policy change, and oftentimes it works, or to get more funding for something because somebody else has basically confirmed the thing that they have been trying to say. So it's another weird twist on, I guess we're somewhat external actor, but still within government.
Right.
But so it's partly reflecting on the implementation, what hasn't gone well with the policy and how to make it better, or how to have more money around making it more effective or efficient. And they love efficiency.
Yeah.
So if it's an efficiency gain, they'll be really into making a change.
Right. And efficiency would be like the height of material policy, right?
Well, effectiveness is probably more what you're going for, right? You're trying to achieve the outcomes of your program.
Right.
Is what you're really doing.
That would be the hope.
So this is Ann. So I worked for the Inspector General Evaluation Office for 15 years. So yeah, I was in that same position in terms of the thing I didn't understand though when I worked that side before I came to the agency was, you know, we would always say, well, you know, if we point out the problems, then that agency can then take that request and request more funding to fix things. And I don't know, there have been changes in agencies because of these types of reports, these oversight agencies, I agree, but I think it was with a lack of understanding of how the budget process actually works in the agencies. There's not, again, an opportunity to do that in most agencies. So, but still, it is an outside player who can provide some influence to do what the agencies wanted to do anyway. So I would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, and we really never dealt with, you know, inspectors general, JAO, in the policy class, and to be honest, very little research on public policy making really addresses the role that they play. I mean, they're not included in, to my knowledge, any model of public policy making that's out there in the academic community.
Yeah, that's correct. But Paul Light, I don't know if you've read his work, but he's done some work on analyzing sort of the role of the inspectors general's offices. And I remember it's probably been 20 years ago where he came to us when I was in DC and basically pleaded with our office, our evaluation office. He's like, you're one of the last people who can actually speak truth to power in terms of what's really going on with some of these programs. And sort of it was sort of inspiring, but actually very depressing.
Yeah,
keep doing your work because there's very few independent people who are looking at things and trying to, and there are these state offices like you're in, which I have observed have, you know, they have at least the opportunity to do some really good work.
Right. I mean, some of the peers across states don't have the latitude that we actually do, where we are half of our work is directed by the appropriations committees, what they want us to study, but the other half, basically I get to pick. So sometimes we land on something that actually, when that report goes out, ends up being an agenda setter that no one in the legislature was planning to make an issue. It gets in the press, and then sometimes it does lead to at least discussion and debate, but sometimes changes in policy. But for the most part, our counterparts are directed by a committee. Their work is often directed by a committee. Ours is partly, but not totally.
So GAO, it's like 90% requests from Congress, but they are an agent of Congress. Now at HHS Inspector General, and this has been like 15 years ago, but it was more like 70% generated from the Inspector General, 30% from requesters. But what happened over time is actually they started getting money reimbursed from the Medicare Trust Fund because they would identify so many cost savings for Medicare. And so a lot of their work eventually got directed, but essentially they controlled the agenda in terms of what topics they looked at.
Right.
Yeah,
So
but the
that's
point
an
that I want-
important distinction.
yeah, the point that I want to make is not that nobody's studying it, it's that nobody's integrated it into a larger theory, a larger model of the policymaking process. It's one of those, I mean, it's actually
But they're not
characteristic
academics
of-
and they don't publish.
I'm sorry?
Because they're not academics and they don't publish. That's why. We did so many
Oh.
studies in the IG, but none of it was published in, you know, peer-reviewed literature, so it doesn't get captured.
Well,
That's my
it's
observation.
gonna take an academic to do it, because you have to then take a look at the policymaking process in its totality. And if you're doing the study and you're within that office, you don't necessarily see everything that's going on there. It's like a big job. It's one of the reasons that there's not a lot of work being done. It's really hard to do, and you need to have an incredible amount. It is why I opened this thing up, to get, you know, like information and experience from all of you folks, because you can't be in one spot and even understand everything about the role that spot plays in the larger process. It's a hard thing. On top of that, the academics who study the bureaucracy and bureaucratic agencies and inspectors general, they're often trained to do much narrower research. And so they're not even, and academics are not trained to have that anymore. They're not trained to have that more general perspective on developing a larger theory, a larger model. If you want to get published, you do something narrow, in great depth, or tons of statistical analysis with a narrow question, so that you can't get challenged by the folks who review your research. It militates against exactly the kind of thing that I think is important, and was the motivation for doing this whole thing. You know, we can do little parts of it, but that's not, for me, that's not satisfying. I want to be able to wrap my arms around the whole thing. I mean, I think we've made a lot of progress. I think mentioning inspectors generals and GAO, that's a really cool thing to think about, and think about how you might kind of plug that into the whole process. I mean, you've got some folks have some really interesting, cool anecdotal things that you probably could develop into more general propositions. But yeah, I mean, that was sort of where I was going. It's not as though there's no literature out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that the effective inspectors general's offices, and that's shifted a little bit over time as it's spread across government. Those people who are effective, those senior leaders, I mean, they understand how the policy process works and how to influence it. I mean, the really good ones.
But yeah, that's different. Yeah. That's different. That's them understanding their particular strategic role that they can play. And part of that goes into the art part of all this, is because, you know, you said there are some that are effective and some that aren't effective, and they can have some sense of the things that make them more effective. And then they have to know how to execute it. They need to know how to frame things so that, given the current political circumstances, how can they be effective in doing that? It's sort of a combination of art and science for them to be good.
Right,
at.
and we've been under assault at various times as well under various administrations. So it's not a monolith. There's a lot of variability.
Yeah, I will share with you. I almost quit working at St. Mary's for the opportunity to work with Bill Moran, who was actually his daughter, Betsy Moran, was one of our students. And we've had a few students who then kind of went through his office. And when, well, I won't say the conditions, but at a certain point, I went in and
Yeah.
visited him, and that sounded like so much fun. Because you could do, I mean, there was research associated with it. That was really attractive. You know, I could do research. There were really smart people in the office, fun people. And Bill was one of those folks like Ann is describing. I mean, he really knew how to be effective.
So Pat, Bill hired me.
Right.
Yeah, and I worked for Bill for a number of years.
Yeah.
And he was my mentor. Yeah, and Bill was, yeah, you know he passed, right?
I do.
You could have been Pat's coworker, Ian. Come on now. Pat.
Oh my God, Pat, we would have had so much fun. There's like stories we can tell about, there was some really good work that was done, kind of, and that changed over time too, by the way, in terms of what in the law policy implement, that it became much more challenging.
Yeah, I'm sure it would. Yeah, actually, Ann and I don't know if Ann even remembers this. Remember when you were at DOJ?
Yeah. You came to visit.
Well, we were gonna do research together.
Oh my gosh, it's been forever ago. Yes, I have no idea what the content was.
I don't either. I
think I was pregnant, you know.
I remember the beginnings of data collection, but then it just fell through. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, speaking of research, I mean, this sounds like, you know, you've always said that at the beginning of this. I think even in the first session, you were saying, you know, hopefully by the end of this, we will have put together our collective experiences, our understanding, and put together a new model for how policy is created and implemented, if not even two separate models, one for created and passed, one for implementation, you know, by the end of all this. And I know that research is not required of you now in your retired life, Pat, nor did you enjoy a lot of it when you had to do it. But, you know, I think that this is really the start. I'm starting to write all these notes in my consultant fashion of like, how can I capture this in a larger diagram? I do think that this does feel like it's lending itself to maybe uncharted territory, something that could be contributed to a larger political science understanding, academia, obviously being fleshed out larger, but this is exciting that it seems like we're putting together something that hasn't really been, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but something that hasn't really been truly understood in this new world.
Well, like I said, everything has changed. But this has been a change. I'm sorry, this is really boring. I'm talking about the discipline. If you took like my dissertation advisor, that generation of academics thought about big theoretical issues, thought about, you know, big concepts. They would occasionally do things like case studies or really rudimentary quantitative analysis, but they always kept their eye on the prize. They always remained focused on key concepts like democracy, justice, equality. You know, there was always that higher level, and that meant that you dealt with larger theories about what's going on. Over time, that's kind of gone away, and to succeed in the profession, you then have to address narrower and narrower sorts of questions, so that there's a friend of mine who taught in a graduate program. I'm gonna leave all this anonymous. He taught in a graduate program, and there was a graduate student, and he's sort of my generation. He had a graduate student in the program who could do amazing things with statistics that dazzled everyone. He just ticked off my friend because he never bothered to think about whether how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, how in the world that mattered for politics. It was just an easily researchable question, so you could get published. And because it was narrow, you wouldn't attract nearly as much criticism from the folks who were reviewing that manuscript for publication in the journal. And at this point, all the important scholarship has moved from books into scholarly journals. Okay. But from my friend's perspective, my perspective, my dissertation advisor's perspective, this guy is totally worthless, and you wouldn't want him in your department, and you wouldn't want to pick him out. He's been getting great academic appointments because he's publishing out the wazoo. There is no incentive, no professional incentive anymore for doing the kind of thing that we're doing. And and even if I wanted to sit down, Michelle was tempting me, you know, even if I wanted to sit down and like start writing this book, we wouldn't find a publisher. I'm just telling you, we wouldn't find a publisher. That's not what's going on. I think it's sad, and it's also why I don't think undergraduates get self-published. Thanks, Hannah.
You can self-publish.
Yeah.
With the new generation.
I was just about to pipe in and be like, and once again, Debbie Downer. Wah, wah, wah.
Wah, wah, wah. Yeah. Oh, well, good for you, Jen.
I wasn't necessarily thinking book. I know that seems a little ambitious. I was more thinking about a scholarly article of some sort, an observation. I know now, knowing nothing about the political science field.
And you could, well, and you could still do that if you had already established your name. Like there are policy scholars there's a guy named Ken Meyer, okay, who is actually incredibly helpful to me in my career. If he wrote it, get published. It would absolutely get published. I'm just a little peon in the vineyards. But there is that kind of bias.
So we still have to cover the courts, which I think might actually move us well into implementation too. So we can talk about where that fits in for a future session.
Yeah, we're sort of running late anyway. We can start off with the courts. Again, 2 weeks from today, start off with the courts, and then move into implementation. And I will, as promised, I will post the sort of overview stuff on implementation from the old course. I'll post that on the group page.
Perfect.
And actually, you know what? Please do the following. Those of you, and I know a bunch of you can really contribute to that. Sort of raise your hand. When that goes up, sort of make a note like, I want to jump in. I plan on jumping in, just to let everybody know that you're gonna go.
Great. All right, everyone. Good luck in the next week. Xanax, if you have it. I don't know. I'm just kidding. Lots of alcohol. Who knows? It will certainly be a different world when we all join again. So wish you all the best. See you on the other side.
Take care, folks.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Pat. Appreciate it.
Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.